Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning for those joining us from Asia. And thank you for being with us today for this important conversation on the impact of U.S. presidential election on Asia. So this is a part of our Seminar on Contemporary Asia series. And I'm Gi-Wook Shin. I'm director of the Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center. It's my pleasure to moderate today's panel and set the stage for our discussion. So with Trump return and the red sweep, looks like, both House and Senate, we are witnessing the solidification of Trumpism as an influential political ideology, one that has begun to transcend traditional American conservatism. Trumpism, marked by a blend of economic nationalism, nativism, and strongman approach to leadership, could have a lasting impact not only on American society, but also on a liberal global order. Trump's foreign policy agenda is anticipated to follow the core principles of his American First policy, which emphasize economic self-interest, unilateralism, and recalibrating alliances based on financial contributions, in contrast to the multilateral, alliance-driven, and diplomatically engaged approach seen during the Biden administration. The stakes for Asia are high, actually very high, as this approach will likely create significant shifts across the Asia-Pacific region. Okay, today my colleague, experts in democracy, trade, human rights, and international relations will help us unpack these complexities and shed light on what lies ahead for the U.S.-Asia relationships. Okay, from my left, my colleague, Frank Fukuyama, he is a well-known expert in democracy. He's a senior fellow here at Stanford and also director of our master program in international policy. So he has written many books, including The End of History and The Last Man. And his latest book, Liberalism and Its Discontents, published by I think publishing like 2 years ago, right? About 2 years ago. And then Tsutsui, my colleague at the center, is also a senior fellow at FSI and directing our Japan program, also deputy director of our center. So he has written all the winning books, Human Rights and the State. And then to my far left, Mr. Gita Wirjawan. So he's a visiting scholar at the Pre-Court Institute, and he was with us for the last 2 years as a visiting scholar as well. So he was Indonesia's Minister of Trade and chairman of its investment coordinating boards, among many other things. Okay, today I ask each panelist to start by addressing two things. One is their overall reaction to the election. And number two, identify one issue. Among many other things, I'm sure you like to talk a lot of things. But one issue that would affect Asia the most, the entire region, or a particular area or country. So this will be on a hybrid actually event. So I think there are many people joining online, and then you are welcome to submit your questions through Q&A function. And also it's on the record. I believe there are some media in the audience, so that it's on the record. So let's just start with Frank.
Okay, thank you, Gi-Wook. It's great to be with all of you. It's been a really interesting couple of weeks. Not to say a couple interesting 8 years in American politics. So several things to say right at the outset. This election, I think, is very significant because it's not an accidental election. When Trump was first elected in 2016, a lot of people thought that it was kind of an accident, that he actually lost the popular vote. He was running against a very unpopular Democratic candidate, Hillary Clinton. And people, in a way, I have to admit, I believe some of this myself, thought that this was an anomaly and that things would snap back to the kind of normal liberal consensus that had dominated for most of the post-war period. But the thoroughness of the Republican victory last Tuesday indicates that it's really Biden's election that was the anomaly, and that we're really not going to go back to that liberal consensus anytime soon. So Gi-Wook has already, mentioned some of the factors. Republicans are very likely to control the presidency, both houses of Congress. They've really managed to gain control of the Supreme Court. And there really are very few checks. There's some state-level checks, but it's been quite remarkable, the completeness of their victory. And Trump, for the first time since 2004, was a Republican who actually won the popular vote in the United States. That transformation reflects a big sociological change. Basically, the working class in the United States has migrated from the Democratic to the Republican Party. This has been a long time coming. It really began in the 1980s under Reagan, but it's been quite decisive. And also the contest just socially is different because it's really all based on education. 20, 30 years ago, you couldn't really distinguish between Republicans and Democrats in terms of their levels of education, but now you can. So the Democrats have become the party of the college educated, and the Republicans are not. And this is important because I've heard especially a lot of Asian commentators, supposedly very knowledgeable about the United States, who are arguing that this election is not going to make a big difference. That, we dealt with Trump already for 4 years between 2016 and 2020, and we learned how to handle him. People were really worried at that time that he was going to be hugely disruptive, but actually it turned out that, he wasn't that bad. Now, I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen. I can't see into the future, but I do think that there are a number of reasons for thinking that we ought to take seriously the things he says rather than just assuming, well, he's full of hot air and he'll say a lot of outrageous things, but he doesn't really act on them, because the stuff that he said is pretty dramatic and pretty radical. And I do believe that this time around he wants to act on them. And I think there's reason to think that he's going to be able to pursue these policies more effectively than in the first term. Most of that has to do with personnel, because when he was first elected, he actually, I don't think, thought he would be president. He didn't come in with a big retinue of people that could be assistant secretaries and deputy assistant secretaries and members of the National Security Council. He really had to rely on the old Republican Party, and that's what he did. But he went through 44 senior officials, including 26 cabinet ministers, who either had to resign or were fired by the end of the 4 years, which is a remarkable turnover. And all these people left because they couldn't get along with him, that they were sort of more traditional mainstream Republicans, and he was not, and he didn't like that. And this time around, I think he's much more committed to getting people that are loyalists. We've seen a couple of examples of that, like Elise Stefanik at the United Nations. Actually, I don't know quite what to make about that, because she was actually a normal Republican until Trump came along, and then all of a sudden she becomes a big Trumpist. But that's where the incentives in the party are right now. I would say that in terms of Asia, there are several things that you can say right off the bat. And the first really has to do with economic policy, which I'm sure my colleagues will be talking at greater length about. But Trump's announced plans for economic policy are just crazy, I mean, not just going after China, which, you know, Biden has been happy to indulge in, but, you know, 20% across the board tariffs for every other country in the world, whether they're friends or foes of the United States. In fact, I think that this is so unrealistic that this is one in which I think Trump may actually be forced to back down on, because, you know, he and a lot of his supporters keep saying that Americans don't pay tariffs, you know, the other countries pay tariffs, which of course is ridiculous. It's going to lead to almost instantaneous return to inflation if he actually goes ahead with it. I actually think it's going to lead to a lot of corruption, because every company, you know, American-based company in the country has a supply chain that involves Asia at some point. And every one of these companies is going to be going to the White House asking for an exemption to an across-the-board tariff. And this is just a formula for the most incredible corruption you've ever seen, because, you know, these will not be done on some principled basis. I mean, you know, with Biden's protectionism, at least there's kind of a rationale for wanting to disengage from strategic industries, but this one is across the board. And so I think who gets an exemption and who doesn't will be completely a result of patronage and, you know, payoffs and that sort of thing. And it's also going to have immediate, you know, effects, because people aren't going to simply want to go along with this. I guess one final thing I'll say, it's funny, there was an article in the Times this morning about how the Chinese opposition to the Chinese Communist Party is really divided on Trump, and some of them are skeptical and some of them love him. And that reflects a difficulty in evaluating really where he stands. My own view is the following, that he likes to talk tough about China, but he likes Xi Jinping and admires him a great deal. But one thing that was pretty clear in the first term is he does not want to get involved in another military conflict. A lot of his case to the American people right from the beginning is that we had gotten sucked into these wars, these foreign wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and he doesn't want anything to do with that. And if you look at his behavior in the first 4 years, he really was trying to avoid, you know, backing up his tough rhetoric with actual use of military force. And that means that any ally that's counting on real support if things get really tough, I think has got to think carefully about whether that's actually going to be forthcoming, which will then set off, you know, a reaction in terms of trying to be self-sufficient and so forth. So maybe I'll just stop with those.
Okay, thanks, Frank. I have some follow-up questions, but I'll save for later. So, Gio.
Great, thank you, Gi-Wook, for organizing this event, and I'm really privileged and honored to be on this panel with distinguished speakers and colleagues of mine here. I was in Midwest leading up to the election the last several days before November 5th in Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, observing and participating in presidential campaigns. And some of the people that I talked to, for a long time, there was a potential of, actually stronger potential of Trump winning. And then in the last days, there was a lot of reporting that Harris might actually come back and win. So the results were not that surprising, but still kind of shocking after observing what was going on. And to put it in sort of perspective, this year, year 2024, was billed as the year of elections. And in addition to the planned elections in India, South Korea, and so on, we ended up having elections in Britain, France, and Japan, which I'll get to in a while. But everybody knew that this was U.S. election was the big one, and the sort of course of the world, course of democracies will be, if not determined, shaped strongly by the outcome of this election. And as the outcomes were announced, a lot of people like David Sanger wrote very quickly in New York Times how this spelled the end of the post-World War II U.S. leadership in the world. And I wouldn't venture to predict what Trump would do. He's so unpredictable. I don't know what's going to happen. But it is safe to say that America First will continue, and the United States will create a huge vacuum in upholding the international liberal order. So for somebody like me who has been studying global human rights and spread of democracy and rule of law, that's a cause for a lot of concern. Well, again, we don't know what might happen, but that's the main takeaway for me is that the for what we've seen as the forces for good, like promoting democracy and so on, that those forces will weaken in the coming years, potentially decades. For Japan, this comes at a really bad time. A lot of Japanese wish that former Prime Minister Abe was still alive. He was one world leader who got along with President Trump in his first term, and by all accounts did a decent job of sort of managing and containing him. He's gone, and as I said, Japan had an election. There was the LDP, the ruling party presidential election on September 27th. A month later, there was a lower house election, which determines who's in power. And surprisingly, presidential election was won by somebody named Ishiba, who had been kind of an opposition within the ruling party against Abe and Suga and Kishida regime. That was kind of a surprise. And then, much more surprisingly, the ruling coalition, LDP and Komeito coalition, lost the majority for the first time since 2009, when the Democratic Party of Japan came to power. So yesterday, Prime Minister Ishiba was reappointed as Prime Minister because the opposition, despite the loss of majority in the lower house by LDP and the ruling Komeito, the ruling coalition, the opposition parties couldn't quite form an alliance to unseat Prime Minister Ishiba. So he was reappointed yesterday, and so he will be the Prime Minister for the foreseeable future, at least for a few months. And that, a lot of people in Japan, observers, pundits, are apprehensive about this because, well, it's hard to predict personal chemistry, but by all, it doesn't seem good. Prime Minister Ishiba is a very logical, conscientious. I'm not suggesting Trump is illogical, but maybe I did. But he's a very sort of meticulously argued. He likes to make an argument in details, and he takes time. He's not a soundbite kind of person. And he was already talking about kind of revisiting the status of forces agreements with the U.S. and that kind of stuff, and that doesn't quite bode well either. So so people are worried about him, and now a lot of people are talking about other politicians in Japan, like Aso, Motegi, who had some dealings with Trump and Trump officials in the first term. They might work out better. And so there's a lot of hand-wringing in Japan about how to deal with Trump 2.0, even though they kind of foresaw this outcome within a year or so. So we'll see how it goes. But Japanese leaders, elites, thought that they were prepared, but they're not quite sure what to do. What are the big issues, the first issues to hit Japan and Asia in Trump 2.0? I think security is definitely a big issue, and it will grow in its importance. But immediately, my sense, and again, it's hard to predict, my sense is that the immediate focus would be in Ukraine, Russia, and Middle East, because these are more urgent issues. And unless China makes any kind of quick moves, China, Taiwan, those issues can wait a little bit. Now, North Korea is Gi-Wook can talk more about this, but North Korea, forming an alliance with Russia, that's a relatively immediate concern. But on security front, there's still some time for Japan to adjust to Trump presidency. And also, Japan had been on a path toward more autonomous kind of foreign policy for the really last 10, 15 years. So it's actually, Japan is more prepared and Japan can buy some time there. Economy, trade, that's probably the more immediate issue that would hit Japan. And as Frank said, we don't know exactly what kind of tariffs on what countries, on what products, on what industry that Trump 2.0 might impose. But I think there's a good chance that Japan would be asked to join the United States in, for instance, imposing tariffs on imports from China, or technological export controls that the US has been engaging in, and Japan has kind of like circumventing that to a certain extent. But there might be greater pressure to sort of line up with the United States in dealing with China economically, which would put a great deal of strain on Japanese economy, Japanese businesses. That would be the immediate challenge, I think, on the horizon for Japanese people, especially business people and political leaders. I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you, Kiyo. Let me now turn to Gita.
I've not been known as somebody who believes in superstition. I must confess that in a number of fora that I've been speaking at, and also board meetings, I've been sharing that I've been dreaming in the past few months, and each time in my dream there would have been this visualization of MBS, Maloney, Modi, Xi Jinping, Putin, Prabowo, and Trump high-fiving each other at the G20 meeting. And I swear to God, I'm not lying. And this has been occurring in my head, in my dream, for the last maybe 8 months or so. And this, I think, is not an indication of my superstitiousness, but I think it's an indication of something that may not necessarily be unique in the US. It's quite pervasive in many other parts of the world, particularly Southeast Asia, which is where I'm from, where I've noticed the political calculus has been moving to the right quite systematically. And this would have been on the back of what I've been arguing, repeatedly for the last few years, in that there hasn't been a commensurate democratization of ideas and or capital as much as we would have been seeing the democratization of information in the last 20, 30 years or so. And this is manifested empirically in the rising inequality of income, inequality of wealth, inequality of opportunities, and centripetality of economic development, where you would have seen higher, more accelerated economic development in primary cities as opposed to that in secondary, much less regional cities. So as much as we would have seen the political calculus moving to the right, I want to just add to this the broad stroke of how I think the economies of the US and Southeast Asia will play out. We've heard sound bites coming out of the Trump team that, they're quite serious about the potential deportation of undocumented workers. And this could amount to whether it's 1.3 million up to 8 million. I think this has the propensity to reduce not just production, but also productivity in the US. On top of that, I think we've also heard soundbites about the potential or prospect of Trump's wanting to erode into the independence of the Fed. This, I think, will entail a higher risk-return profile for the US. And the third really is what he's been announcing for a long time, i.e. the imposition of 10% tariff all across, and with respect to certain countries, 60 to 100%. I think the short-term consequence of this is almost certainly the strengthening of the dollar on the back of the less importation of goods and services from the rest of the world, because the United States is not buying foreign currencies as much as it has been. But I do believe, or I'm in the camp that believes that I think the burst of demand will be short-lived on the back of the recognition that I think the importation of finished and capital goods from overseas by the US, I think will impede growth. And this will, I think, entail a higher degree of risk to the extent that financial capital allocation will have to be reallocated as to seek higher risk-adjusted returns. And this is where I think Southeast Asia could fit in. I think some parts of Southeast Asia could be a natural beneficiary of this reallocation of financial capital from the US. However, it has to be resolutely backed by the ability of Southeast Asia to provide clarity on rule of law, without which capital allocation is just not going to take place as robustly as we would have hoped for. So you've got the political calculus and you've got the economic broad stroke. Now, if we peel the onion, with respect to trade, I do believe that, if you look at Southeast Asia and the US, the bilateral trade is about $520 billion. That was in 2022, of which certain countries have enjoyed continuous trade surpluses with the US. High on the list is Vietnam. In 2022, Vietnam enjoyed a surplus of about $120 billion. After Vietnam, you would have a club of 4 or 5 countries of Thailand, Malaysia, Philippines, and Indonesia, each of which would have enjoyed a surplus of $40 billion or less. However, Singapore, I think, has anticipated this Trump victory. They've basically done trade with the US to the extent that they're going to have a deficit with the US. They had a deficit of about $38 billion in 2022. And this, I think, speaks of the degree to which certain countries in Southeast Asia have anticipated and are likely to be a good beneficiary of whatever potential policy posture that's going to come out of the Trump administration. Now, I must emphasize that Southeast Asia has historically, traditionally been a positive net beneficiary of a Republican leadership in the US. And this is on the back of, I think, the tendency for any Democratic leadership in the US to over-intellectualize the narrative with less transactionality in the picture. Whereas the Southeast Asians, I think they prefer transactionality as opposed to intellectualization. And this is manifested in, I think you would agree with me, in that some leaders in Southeast Asia have a tendency to be a bit autocratic, as a result of which we've had some failed democracies in some countries in Southeast Asia. So from a personality standpoint, I think they're going to be able to know how to deal with a personality like Trump's. Now, that's on the trade side. On the investment, I think on the investment, there is this expectation that on the back of this massive imposition of tariff on China, there is hope for some degree of reshoring of manufacturing capabilities from China to Southeast Asia. I do believe it's a little bit misplaced by way of the 3 factors. I think China is a massive industrial base, and they've got much higher marginal productivity than most countries in Southeast Asia. Secondly, China has massive rare earth capabilities. Third, China has massive green technology, which are not likely to get dislocated onto places like Southeast Asia. As much as the Southeast Asian food is quite suitable to the Chinese, but I do believe that if there's any reallocation of capital for reshoring purposes, I think it's going to be somewhat marginal, especially if many countries in Southeast Asia are not going to be able to provide the kind of rule of law that perhaps Singapore has been able to show. So, final comment is really with respect to the green or the environmental stuff. I predict, I think the GDP is going to be put aside, and this will have a consequence on Southeast Asia, i.e. Vietnam and Indonesia. Vietnam did a deal on JETP for about $15 billion, Indonesia $20 billion. At the rate that the US is going to disengage from JETP, I think we're looking at about a $2 billion impact on the $20 billion for Indonesia, $1 to $1.5 billion impact on the $15 billion deal. IPEF, the Indo-Pacific economic framework, I think it's exposed. I don't foresee Trump being able to continue with that sort of, framework, which in my view, has the aims and ambitions that are less ambitious than necessary from an environmental standpoint. So I'm saying with full cognizance of the fact that historically we've been able to deal with a Republican leadership slightly better than a Democratic leadership. And I do believe that Southeast Asia, I think, will be able to somewhat deal with the unique personality in Trump.
Okay, thank you, Gita. So let me make brief comments on Korea so that we can have some conversation. I think overall, I have to say that election outcome is a bad news for Korea. So I was in Korea the week before the election. Koreans kept asking me who's gonna win. The media was saying that it's a very tight race. It can go either way. So I said, who knows? But then I say, if I have to, make a bet. I think Trump is going to win, and I think they got very disappointed. My prediction. So I think there are three things I want to point out. One is alliance. Okay, so it's quite clear that Trump is going to demand for Seoul to pay more for their defense, right? And during his term, he demanded Seoul to pay more, and even he threatened to pull out troops out of Seoul, out of Korea. But last time, the Congress, really passed legislation to prevent. But now he basically controls both Senate and House, and I'm not sure whether it can happen again. And I think that will, put President Yoon in difficult position because he's been really promoting alliance. And, as you know, U.S.-Japan, U.S.-Korea alliance and U.S.-Japan-Korea trilateral cooperation has been going very well last couple of years. But now Yoon with a very low rating, he will face a very difficult situation. Okay, now North Korea, maybe even worse. Okay, so Trump is likely to resume summit diplomacy with Kim Jong-un. I think John Bolton said a few days ago that he wouldn't be surprised if Trump go to Pyongyang next spring. So I don't know whether all this is going to happen, but I think he's going to resume summit diplomacy with Kim Jong-un. Okay, then I think North Korea is likely to sidestep, South Korea. Okay, and then because then the Pyongyang and Washington maybe direct negotiation and talks, then it will really put South Korea in very awkward position. Besides, I think compared to let's say 2019, when Kim and Trump met in Hanoi, I think North Korea is now much more leverage. Better technology in maybe ICBM. Now also closer ties with Russia. So probably North Korea may try to pursue nuclear arms control, not complete denuclearization. Okay, then I think South Korea may demand going for nuclear as well. And then I think the whole peninsula, whole Northeast Asia may get into some kind of arms race. That's my concern. So finally, whether Biden policy, especially IRA and CHIP Act, will survive. As you know, many Korean companies and Chinese companies, they invested in the United States, expecting subsidy. And I don't think, as far as I know, like a TSMC, SK Hynix, they are still negotiating with U.S. government about subsidy. I don't think they signed the final contract. And then, my understanding is that even with the subsidy, it's not easy to make money in this country. So I was saying that it makes a political sense to invest, but it doesn't make business sense. So without subsidy, they will be in a very difficult position. So I think that's other bad news, I think, for South Korea, maybe Taiwan too. So let me start here regarding Korea, and then move on to some questions and conversation. So let's just start with a more broader question, maybe with Frank. So, looking back this election, I mean, of course, to be fair, Harris, she didn't have enough time to formulate her message. But then, if you look at, Trump or Trumpism, whether you like that or not, they have a very strong message, very clear message. But Democrats, even when Biden won the election, it's more like anti-Trump forces. It's not really clear message about the future of United States. So how can Democrats regroup and counter Trumpism to present a vision and future for United States? So what would you advise if you're?
Well, I would do several things. Harris was really hurt by her identification with a very, very unpopular administration. So Biden's approval was in the low 30s. It really began to fall after the botched Afghan withdrawal, and it never recovered. And in that kind of a situation, what she really needed to do was to distinguish herself from her boss. And she had an opportunity to do this on The Verge, where she gave an interview and couldn't think of a single thing that she would have done differently from what Biden did. And this was disastrous because that's what people were looking for. I think that she could have made a couple of very clear statements. So the two biggest weaknesses, I think, well, you obviously had inflation, which was top of everybody's list. I'm not sure that she could have come up with a strategy any more than Trump can come up with a strategy to defeat inflation. But, the southern border was a big selling point for Trump. Biden decided to pivot on that very, very late, late in the third year of his administration. They did do this deal with Senator Lankford, which was okay, but they should have done it 3 years earlier. And Harris had an opportunity to say, I'm sorry, but yes, we did make a mistake. We should have done this earlier. We believe in immigration, but we want to control the border, and we're going to take the steps right now to get that under control. That was one thing. There's a whole set of cultural issues. Talking to some of my conservative friends, I can really see how so many of them were aware of Trump's weaknesses and didn't like him particularly, but they disliked the Democrats a lot more. And a lot of that was really over, identity politics, basically. Now, to her credit, Harris did not emphasize in overt ways, oh, I'm going to be the first woman president, I'm going to be the first woman of color to be president, this sort of thing. So she pretty much stayed away from that. But she could have made a break with, the identity categories that have dominated the Democrats' thinking. And that really did them in, because this is, I think, the really most interesting thing about the election. The Democrats were operating under an assumption that your identity, the identity category that you were put in, would determine the way you were going to vote, particularly for African Americans and particularly for Hispanics. That because Trump said mean things about illegal immigrants, that anyone that was Hispanic was therefore going to be inclined to vote Democratic because they didn't like. That turned out to be total nonsense. It's really interesting, in a lot of the postmortems that have been done just in the last week, a lot of Hispanics were the most vehement against illegal immigration, because they said, we struggled and we came across legally, and now the Biden administration is giving all these handouts to these people that broke the law. We don't, we don't like that. We're not being treated fairly. I mean, Trump flipped the entire border, South Texas border with Mexico over that issue, and they used to be very heavily Democratic. They're all voting Republican. And I think at this point, Hispanics in the United States are basically, they'll vote just like whites, and it'll be on the basis of class rather than race. It's really interesting. Trump, was being blamed by liberals for not reaching out and building a broader coalition, but he actually built a multiracial working class coalition. He got a lot of African Americans and especially a lot of Hispanics to vote for him. And this is why I think a lot of the interpretations that you've been hearing over the last 8 years, that what Trump represents is, structural racism and, the patriarchy we'll get to, but that he represents basically a racial backlash among whites who are insecure about their declining status in the country is I think it's just wrong. That actually people are voting more along class lines than along these identity lines. And that's actually a good thing, because I don't think identity politics is a good way to organize a liberal democracy. And so they're voting their class interests, and it doesn't matter whether they're black, brown, or white. They feel solidarity with somebody that's going to protect them from foreign competition and, all of this sort of thing. The other issue, the one identity category that's still super important is gender. And there you saw this huge gender gap appear. Partly it was driven by a tactical consideration because of the Dobbs decision. Democrats did well in a lot of the by-elections that happened after Dobbs, where a lot of women turned out. And I think that the Harris team thought that they could drive up female participation of women that were angry over abortion restrictions, and that would be enough to push them over the top in what they assumed was going to be a very close election. Well, it turned out women did not vote for Harris in nearly the percentages that they had in the 2022 midterm elections. But the other big problem was that the Democrats did almost nothing to appeal to men, and particularly to young men, whereas the Republicans were laser focused on Hulk Hogan and Joe Rogan and all of these other cultural megaphones that spoke directly to young men, not just white young men, but also Black and Hispanic young men. And so so I think, the Democrats had no choice but to try to turn out the female vote as much as they could. But they really needed to be able to offer something also to young men as reasons why they should vote for them, and they didn't do that. What that is in the future, I'm not quite sure. I think that one of the huge changes that's taken place as a result. So I said this in my least read book, a book called The Great Disruption. It was published back in 1989. But I think that the world has gone through this enormous transformation where incomes, by and large, are now earned by people sitting behind computer screens in offices, not by people lifting heavy objects off the floors of factories. And in that kind of world, women just have a much more natural place in the workforce. And that's reflected in the hundreds of millions of women that entered the workforce. Female labor participation is up in every country except maybe some in the Middle East, across the board. And that in turn has disrupted family life. And, especially in working class families, there are many families where the main income is now being earned by the woman rather than the man. And that's created, a lot of insecurity among young men. Also, I've noticed this in culture. So I wrote this little blog post about a month ago about female hitmen. So this is my favorite genre of Hollywood movie. And there's a lot of them out there. My favorite one is actually this movie called Kate, about this. Yeah, so she's a gaijin. She's a white woman in Tokyo who works for the Yakuza as a hit woman. But it's interesting because if you think about the number of Hollywood movies in which there's a really powerful female hero or heroine, and not just powerful in social terms, but physically powerful, so they get jumped by 6 really burly guys and she manages to knock all of them out, because she's so good at martial arts and so forth. So I just think that culturally, the world has become less hospitable to young men in particular whose position in the social hierarchy is not yet established. And that anxiety translated into a lot of votes for Donald Trump that, that Harris failed to recover.
So we'll come back. Okay, so whether Democrats can rebuild a winning coalition, that will be a big question, I guess, 5 years from now. Okay, so now in the Giyo, you can already mention about U.S.-Japan alliance, and I agree with you that we should give a lot of credit to Abe to manage U.S.-Japan alliance. As you mentioned, Ishiba is not Abe, and I think his rating is not high. So how Japan can manage alliance with the United States, and also maybe continue this close trilateral cooperation with U.S. and South Korea, because Yoon's rating also very low, and actually during the first term of Trump, Seoul and Washington, Trump and Moon Jae-in, they shared common interests regarding North Korea. So I don't think Moon played golf, but still I don't think they liked each other, but still they shared policy interests. And there was a report in Korean paper that now Korean President Yoon is learning golf or playing golf again. So following maybe Abe's lesson. So what would happen to this alliance and trilateral cooperation?
Yeah, so Ishiba, I should have also emphasized that one problem for Ishiba is that the power base domestically is very weak. And President Trump, he likes authoritarian leaders because he likes powerful people who can get things done in their domestic domain. And Abe had that when he was in power. Ishiba doesn't have that right now because he's basically running the government with gun to his head, because at any moment the opposition could coalesce and mount a no confidence vote and end his prime ministership if the opposition can get together. That's a big if, but that's where he is. So that's a challenge. And starting off, there's a lot of reports in Japan about how President Macron talked for 25 minutes with President Trump to congratulate him. President Yoon talked for 12 minutes. And Prime Minister Ishiba talked for 5 minutes. There's a rumor that Trump hung up. Well, maybe, but that doesn't bode well. You don't have enough time. There's also an interesting story about how Prime Minister Ishiba used to be in a golf club in college. What does that mean? I don't know. But we can't really resort to this kind of golf relationship as it worked. I mean, just because it worked with Abe. So for Japan, I've been talking about how it's with the U.S. kind of withdrawing and creating a vacuum in the region. It's an opportunity for Japan to be a leader in rebuilding or continuing the international liberal order in Asia, particularly in alliance with South Korea and Southeast Asia, perhaps Australia, India as well. So there's an opportunity there, but for that to succeed, and Abe, Prime Minister Abe was quite successful in doing so. For instance, the United States left TPP, Indonesia left TPP too, but Abe regrouped and executed CPTPP, which exists in operation now as a good model for regional trade agreement. Free and open Indo-Pacific, FOIP, was an Abe's idea. The Quad, India, Australia, Japan, and US, that also is a brainchild of Abe, really starting in his first term in 2007. So forming a regional alliance on security domain, economic domain, trade, and so on to counter China's threat, that's been the game plan for Japan for the last 15 years or so. And I think that should continue on. It's a good model. A lot of people in the US now, even Trump in his first term, recognize that as a good option. So that Japan should continue to push for that. Whether Trump 2.0 buys into that, not sure. But if it's true, National Security Advisor has just been announced, Mike Waltz, who actually has some relationship with Japan. So that bodes well for Japan to play more of a role in influencing Trump foreign policy.
Gita, as you mentioned, there are two elephants, right? U.S. and China for your area of Southeast Asia, and one could argue that there are more stability regarding China because Xi Jinping has been in power 10 years plus. Is likely to stay for a while, right? So in a sense, maybe more predictable, more stability regarding China, but so much change up and down regarding the United States. So this election outcome will maybe change Southeast Asian positioning or position toward U.S. and China, or it's more or less same. You also mentioned that IPEF may not survive. So what's like Southeast Asian positioning towards China and United States, and any change or more or the same?
I think it's important to recognize that Southeast Asia is very much used to multipolarity, and this is manifested in the last 2,000 years, right? By way of its having been graced by so many different cultural, colonial, economic forces, right? In the last 2,000 years, and we've been able to shed a lot less blood than some other regions. The trade between China and Southeast Asia is about $750 billion, almost equivalent to that between China and the US. The trade between Southeast Asia and the US is about $520 billion. Sizable, right? And I think it's safe to assume that for the most part, with the exception of one or two countries in Southeast Asia, for the most part, I think the inkling is really towards the US for predominantly security purposes, secondarily economic purposes. Whereas with China, it's almost absolutely for economic purposes, not for security purposes, for the most part, for Southeast Asia. Now, I do believe that the natural intersection between Southeast Asia with China and or the US really boils down to AI and energy transition. AI is something that I think is going to impact, the lives and livelihoods of many around the world, including those in Southeast Asia. I do believe this is an area where I think the US is going to play a more proactive role. Whereas on an energy transition, I think it's safe to assume that I think China will play a much more proactive role. At the rate, not only the solar panels in Southeast Asia, but those in California are built in China, right? But in terms of technological capital allocation, I think China is the natural allocator. But in terms of the financial capital allocator, I think the US and the West are the natural choice. And this is empirically manifested in the limits or limitations of the BRI. In the last 11 years, I've said that, ever since they announced for Southeast Asia amounting to about $171 billion for all of Southeast Asia after 11 years, the realization so far has been about $20 billion. This is, I think, empirically a projection or reflection of the limitation of capital exportation capabilities of China. However, the Southeast Asian leaderships, I think they have to not only understand this, but they have to narrate the narrative a little bit better. And I can tell you that Prabowo spoke with Trump yesterday for 8 minutes. So if it's any consolation, I counted. I was watching the video. Maybe I should slow it down so it might become 16 minutes. But it's not a reflection of the shallowness of the relationship or potential relationship. I do believe that Prabowo in Indonesia, I think his personality gels with that of Trump. And I do believe that most of the leaders in Southeast Asia, whether they're the second or third generation, they're used to the autocratic mentality. I'm not going to mention countries because it's sensitive, but I think the leaders of many countries in Southeast Asia, they've anticipated this move, and I think they know how to deal with Trump because of that transactionality. I do believe that we are entering, at least from a Southeast Asian standpoint, we're entering what I call the subscription premium era, where if you pay the premium, you're likely to get a better deal. And the premium that's already been paid is manifested in the deficits that some countries in Southeast Asia have already had with the United States. Those that are exposed with massive surpluses like Vietnam, I think they've got their work cut out, as to pivot back to the U.S. under Trump.
Okay, thank you. So I have more question, but I think I'm going to turn to the floor for questions. So I might take maybe like two at once so that we have more. So maybe those two first, yeah, you and then. So please say who you are and then just ask question briefly.
Well, good evening. I'm Darshini. I'm a night journalism fellow from Malaysia. So I'm very curious, Gita, you mentioned this. I'm interested in the security impact of Trump's win, because we still have on the underlying issue China's pressure on South China Sea, and parallel to that, you have the opposition to U.S. funding of Israel's action in Gaza. So how do you think that is going to impact U.S. relationship with Southeast Asia? Because U.S. has always been seen as kind of a counterweight to China in terms of military security. So how do you perceive that? Thank you.
So one more then we'll.
Yeah, fascinating discussion. Thank you very much. And the question I have for the panel, to what extent do international affairs play any role whatsoever in the likely future of this administration? I mean, really, I hate to say this, but does Ukraine really matter? If Russia cements the reincorporation of Ukraine into a kind of neo-USSR, or if China moves against Taiwan in some matter, right? Is that really going to trigger opposition to Trump? And if it's a thoroughly domestic kind of issue, then specifically, what do you think can be done to get this guy out of office?
Okay, so anyone want to start?
Sure, I'll try to answer the first question. I mean, I think it's safe to assume that Trump's victory is less consequential to Southeast Asia than it is to perhaps the Middle East and Europe. And I'm in the camp that believes that his rhetoric somewhat resonates in the context of trying to bring about peace in Ukraine in whatever manner. And that's arguable and debatable. But we in Southeast Asia are generally peace-loving, and this is empirical. We have not shed a lot of blood compared to the Europeans in the last 2,000 years. Now, in the context of the South China Sea, I think we're more exposed than the Taiwan Strait situation on the back of the fact that I think there's a lot more deterrence with respect to the Taiwan Strait as opposed to those with, the South China Sea. But I do believe that Trump is likely to personalize the relationship with Xi Jinping, that it might undermine the Taiwan Strait situation. And what I mean by that is that I think it might accelerate any potential, negative or unintended consequence. Although I'm in the camp that believes that I think peace is almost as likely to be there until such time that there is a semiconductor sovereignty, on China and also on the US, and that's going to take a few years at least. So that will bring about peace with respect to the Taiwan Strait. but with the other hearts in the South China Sea, I think we're more exposed. And this, I think, will depend on the skills with which the leadership of each one of the claimant states would have to basically individualize the conversation with Trump. And I, as an Indonesian, could say that Trump has decided to build 2 golf courses in Indonesia. That, I think, is going to help the bilateralization between the U.S. and Indonesia. I'm sure the leaders in other countries in Southeast Asia are thinking of getting Trump to build golf courses also. So that sort of transactionality, I think, is something that could assuage, any potential concern that could explode or implode in the South China Sea. Now, on Gaza, I'm in a camp that believes that there is so much inertia within the bureaucracy of the United States government that as much as he wants to do something that's probably different from whatever we've seen in the last year or so, I do not expect or anticipate anything better than whatever we might have seen in the last year or so.
Don, I would say that one thing we do know about Trump is he does not want to be seen as a loser. And if the Russians march into Kiev, if China attacks Taiwan and gets away with something, there are a lot of scenarios where he's going to look like a loser. And he knows how damaging the Afghan withdrawal was to Biden. And so that's one thing that makes me a little bit hopeful that he's not simply going to let all these authoritarian countries walk over our friends. On the other hand, he's never been tested by a real crisis, where he had to make some really tough decisions, including ones that involved a fair amount of risk. He talks big and so forth, but we don't know what he's going to be like. And that's where I think the unpredictability is really worrisome because, who knows what's going to, what kind of decisions he'll make.
So I understand your sentiment about Trump, but I think we need to accept the results as they are. And if you're supporting Democrats, I assume you are. I think they need to regroup and hear what Frank just said earlier about the importance of class, economic inequality, and general detachment of liberal university elites like us. This cultural elites point, I really realized this attending both Trump rally and Harris rally. So I went to the final Philadelphia event, and it was supposed to be 7 to 10 p.m. We were there until past midnight. And there was live feeds from different, like Detroit. John Bon Jovi was singing in Detroit, and Christina Aguilera was singing in Arizona. And people started booing, like, put somebody here, we're in Philadelphia, right? And then there's this cultural elites that think that people would just wait and wait for Harris to arrive, and we did, right? And Oprah introduced Harris, and Lady Gaga played, and in the end it was fine. But to expect that people would just wait patiently for 5 hours until the main act comes, that was I felt like that was a little bit condescending, and I think they may have lost a few thousand votes there, as opposed to Trump rally, which is much smaller and production value was so low. But to his credit, the man shows up and talks for 2 hours of meandering thoughts, and it's the greatest hits, right? And people are pleased to be, and everybody had a seat. So that contrast was striking to me, and that's something that I think Democrats need to learn from, to think about how they might be sort of detached from working class populations and even the Hispanics and blacks. They can, as Frank emphasized, you cannot assume that they vote for Democrats just because of their identity background. On the international affairs issues, I think Japan and South Korea are more directly affected by Trump than Southeast Asia, so we can't just ignore him. But I have a proposal to get him more engaged in international affairs in a productive way, is to dangle Nobel Peace Prize. That's also, Prime Minister Abe actually kind of did that a little bit, but he's on his second term, he doesn't have to be around again. What does he care? Right? He probably cares. He talks about Nobel Peace Prize often, that's something that if we use it effectively, I'm talking about to Nobel Peace Prize Committee, they should really pay attention to this, and they can save the world by directing Trump in the direction of, so if they want to broker a peace between Ukraine and Russia, right? If Ukraine loses 20% of its territory as a result, Trump is not going to win Nobel Peace Prize. But if he comes to the different terms and get the war to end, if he solves the Middle East situation, if he solves China-Taiwan situation in a productive way, that could lead him to Nobel Peace Prize, really, and that he might be attracted to that. That's my proposal.
I don't know about the proposal. This may be a disgrace to Nobel Nobel Prize, but so we can take maybe 2 more questions from the audience and go to online questions. Okay, 1, 2, yeah, 1, 2.
Thanks so much. Andrea from the business school. So based on this panel, I'm hearing a dissonance on Trump's approach on dealing with foreign entanglements. So there's a potential global power vacuum, given that he may want to withdraw from the Ukraine and Russia-Ukraine conflict, but at the same time, we just saw that Secretary Walsh was appointed as an independent state director, who's also essentially hawkish against China. So I want to double click on Taiwan again, Professor. How disambiguous will Trump's position be on Taiwan? Will it be very clear that they might want to permanently station troops there, or it will depend on essentially seeing whether he feels that he's losing Taiwan, or will we not know at all, given that unpredictability is essentially the key strength of the Trump presidency administration?
Okay. Well, one more question, then.
Oh yeah. So Dr. Fukuyama said that he thinks Trump would be forced to back down on the tariffs. Do you think people are overreacting, and how do you think he will be forced to back down?
Okay, I will be really surprised if Trump makes a clear commitment to Taiwan. You know, Biden pretty much did that. He said, yeah, of course we're going to defend the island, but I just cannot imagine Trump coming out and certainly stationing troops. Are you kidding? You know, I think that's about the last thing that he would do. You know, there's other scenarios of a blockade and so forth that are a little bit less dramatic, and so that's a little bit harder to know how he'd react there. But he's not, I don't think he's a strong alliance, we're going to defend, you know, our friends type of person. I'm sorry, your question was? Well, I mean, the inflation rate suddenly shoots back up, you know, to 20% because everybody has to pay, you know, for all of their foreign sourced components, you know, this tariff. Well, he does have a choice. He could do what Christina Kirchner did in Argentina. He could sack the head of the statistics office and then kind of pretend that the inflation rate hasn't changed. But that's going to be poison, you know, to any future president that lets the inflation rate go back up. And I think that's going to be an early consequence of putting these kinds of massive tariffs on imported goods. I don't know what he's going to do, but I think we need to take him seriously when he says he's going to do something.
I can try to add to that, Frank. I mean, I
think the minister, so
I'll try to reiterate what I conveyed earlier. I think in the short run, you're going to see this becoming effective, right? There is going to be a spurt of demand on the back of this imposition of tariff all across 10%, certain countries 60 to 100%. And I think the Americans, or at least Trump and his team, would want to see a higher degree of innovation coming out of the U.S., higher degree of productivity and production coming out of the U.S. But you got to combine that with this potential erosion of the independence of the Fed. And you combine that with this potential deportation. I think all these will entail a higher degree of risk, at least from a perception standpoint, if not substance. That, I think, will cause financial capital to be reallocated out as to seek higher risk-adjusted returns. As a result of which, I think there's inevitably going to be a recalibration of the imposition of tariff.
So going back to the year of elections, So a lot of the elections were not great for incumbents, right? So we can look at Trump's result as part of that. And what that means, so in Japan, Britain, all those places, incumbents lost to a certain extent. Even in India, Modi lost a lot of seats, Modi's party. So what that means is that if Trump imposes the tariffs as promised, and then the economy collapses, then the results will come very quickly into 2026, right? So that's another reason why Trump might have to think twice. Whether he listens or not, whether he cares about 2026 results, that's a different story. But assuming that. On Taiwan, in addition to building Trump Tower in Taiwan, I think Taiwan should really, it's not happening right now, right? I'm just joking. But if that, something like that, aggressively pursuing this transactional president with economic benefits, that's probably the current game that would work most effectively to keep him on the Taiwan side. Because Trump has already complained about how TSMC and other semiconductor industry in Taiwan has taken things away from the U.S. companies. So play that up, play up the benefits of engaging with Taiwan and more of a collaborative endeavors with Taiwan that could work well.
We need troops in Taiwan to protect Trump Tower.
Yes, that's why you need a Trump.
And Trump golf course. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So we're going to take two questions from the online audience. So Cheryl, our associate director, she'll be reading two questions.
So we have a couple of follow-up questions for Gita and for Kiyo. For Gita, one person asked, how will various ASEAN countries try to manage Trump and how it will impact their respective relationships with China? There's another question about transactionality with respect to Southeast Asia and the South China Sea. There seems to be an important point that touches upon important public affairs having to do with settling a contest about property and extraction, mining rights in the region. If you can comment on that. For Kiyo, do you think that a U.S. pullback from Asia will result in Japan taking more of a leading role in the region? With the prospect of an absence of a strong U.S. influence in the region, would Japan and South Korea seek to forge closer defense ties in such a scenario? Another person asks about businesses and financial ties between U.S. companies and Japanese conglomerates or small, medium enterprises. You can comment on the situation about those.
I think Southeast Asia's inclination with respect to China, it's likely to continue from an economic standpoint. I foresee the collective trade between China and Southeast Asia to go to $1 trillion from about $750 billion in the next few years. That's not going to stop. That train has left the station, and there's enough of a moving inertia from an industrial standpoint in China as to produce goods and services that are going to be consumed continuously by Southeast Asians. The question is, I think, how will Southeast Asia be able to reshore China's pre-existing manufacturing capabilities, right? And it's safe to assume that there is an overcapacity, and there is a fundamental need by the Chinese and the multinationals in China to reshore this pre-existing capacity or overcapacity. And I'm a believer that Southeast Asia is the natural logical choice. So I think the narrative going forward between Southeast Asia and China would be a continuation of the trading activities as to surpass $1 trillion, but also to make sure that there is this reshoring of manufacturing capabilities, particularly the energy transition related items. This is where I think China is going to be able to play a much more proactive role than the United States or the West. However, that's got to be accompanied by economic capital allocation. This is where I think a bigger homework is on us going forward. Now, on the policy posturing with respect to the South China Sea, there are some in Southeast Asia that believe that the way to settle or resolve the South China Sea is not by way of sovereignty, but it has to be multidimensionalized in the sense that you can carve or splice the cake into one dimension of just creating collective economic development activities for both China and Southeast Asia, and another dimension with respect to how the sovereignty is going to get defined. And that, I think, will take a long time. And I was involved in a code of conduct discussion years ago. And I used to be an optimist. I used to be a code of conduct optimist in the sense that I thought that this was going to get resolved by 2026. At the rate things are going between China and Southeast Asia, I have become slightly more pessimistic about the code of conduct, which I think would resolve issues like sovereignty.
So Japan is well positioned and highly motivated, I think, to fill that vacuum that the United States might leave. And for a country like Japan, which it doesn't have a lot of natural resources, depends on trade, it's very important to maintain the liberal order, predictability, rule of law, right? Those kinds of things are critical for Japan to thrive. So Japan has a great interest in keeping that alive. And if Japan doesn't fill that void, then China will, right, in many ways. So definitely, I think Japan, as I said, there are ways to do that. The second question, I wasn't quite sure, but I think it was about Japan-U.S. economic collaboration. I think the U.S. steel case is a really important one to watch for. A lot of Japanese investments are already coming to the U.S., and if the United States, the Trump administration, further directs the investment from Japan to come to the U.S., then a case like U.S. Steel should actually work out, right? But if that's rejected, Japan Steel's purchase of U.S. Steel, if that's rejected, that leaves a bad taste in the Japanese business people's mouths and bad precedent. So I think that's a case. I don't know exactly how it's going to. It doesn't look that great, but that would be one case to look at.
Okay, so I'm going to ask the final question for discussion. You already mentioned about strong men. Okay, Putin, Xi Jinping. I mean, they'll be in power for a while, right? And then Trump and Modi, right? So I mean, this is the world we will have to live. I don't know how many years for the time being. And oftentimes, I like to compare today's world to 1930s and 1940s, when fascism swept Western Europe. At the time, U.S. and U.K. came to defend liberal democracy, and we survived. I don't see any leader to defend our democracy. So how current era will be written or remembered in history, and how can it defend our liberal democracy given those power of strongmen? So it's a very big question, but I wanted to end our discussion with big question. So you're a big idea guys.
Yeah, I don't see a strong man or a strong nation that's going to defend liberal democracy in general. And in fact, I think that there's too much of an assumption that the world is going to continue to look like it does now, except maybe just a little bit worse, or it could get dramatically worse. I don't think people have taken aboard the fact that there is an active alliance now between Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. There are like 10,000 North Korean troops fighting in, Russia at the moment, and in Ukraine. This is a level of cooperation we've never seen. Bush administration back in the time of the Iraq War talked about an axis of evil, but this is a real coordinated effort, military effort by 4 authoritarian countries to work together to overthrow, a democracy. And, Trump is not going to save them. Unfortunately, Biden didn't do nearly enough to help Ukraine defend itself. So I am really worried about the future geopolitical situation that could get a lot worse than it is right now, with more overt, military aggression. And this is exactly the moment when the democracies ought to be tightening their alliance relationships, and instead we're likely to move in the opposite direction. Yeah, fasten your seatbelts.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree. And in 2022, I thought there has been a lot of conversations about democratic recession. And I thought in 2022, we may have started, democracies may have started comeback with Ukraine war, kind of re-energizing NATO alliance, the midterm election, Democrats didn't do as bad as they thought. So all those things were pointing to comeback in democracies. And I think Larry Diamond just had a piece today that talks about some of that. In 2022, 2023 in Poland, 2024 early on in Brazil and in other places, democratic forces were beginning to not defeat, but at least control, manage some of the illiberal forces domestically. And then this happened here in the US. So that's not very encouraging, but and I agree that there's not. I don't see a strong leader in the world that would contain these illiberal trends and alliances among Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, well, and so on. Italy's prime minister is getting some attention as somebody who emerged as a sort of authoritarian, somebody with authoritarian predilections, but kind of seems like a realistic person. Same way Abe emerged and became more of a realist politician. So maybe Meloni might be one person, and then what a turn of what a plot twist it will be if Italy and Germany and Japan kind of came to rescue democracies this time around. So I have a lot of hopes for Japan to have some kind of strong leader. And Germany the coalition government is collapsing at the moment, but maybe they will have a strong leader. But really, these countries, France also, South Korea, I think would be very important. Those democratic countries really need to reunite and just manage Trump for 4 years, and then make a comeback. And otherwise, we'll have World War III, and the whole world will collapse. So we need to get to work.
To give you perspective, in the 60s, the GDP per capita of South Korea and that of Singapore was less than $100. And if you take that back to the 30s and 40s, most countries in the world were making less than $100 per capita. So if there was one guy that was making more than $20,000, it would have been easier, if not much easier, to propagate upon the others that were making less than $100. I think what we need to recognize is that there's this high degree of revisionism that's coming from guys that used to be tiny but have become somewhat big. India, Nigeria, Turkey, Mexico, Indonesia, Russia. So this revisionism is an inevitability. And this is the characteristic of what I call the much more multipolar world, which I do not foresee will make it any easier for any one particular country to propagate upon others certain value proposition. And we are entering an era where I think value terms are diminishing. Nationalism is on the rise. Nationalism is attached to the aspiration of any nation that's moving up the table, the ladder, as to expand upon its freedom of choice, expand upon its strategic autonomy so that they could climb the global order. I think this will make it somewhat difficult for any one particular guy to tell the world what to do. And this is an inevitable characteristic of multipolarity, which has unfortunately entailed a much higher degree of bilateralization requirement as opposed to multilateralization requirement.
Okay, so that we are ending this panel with about pessimism. I'd like to remain cautiously optimistic for the future, and perhaps maybe new administration has a specific policy for the Asia. Maybe like next spring we might the panel again to assess actual policies. But once again, thank you so much for joining us in person and also online, and hope to see you again. Thank you. Thank you.